So unless you've been living under a rock, most of you have caught wind of this thing called the trial of the Rittenhouse. And it's rather astonishing that in today's day and age, a relatively minor event, at least by comparison to other events of the past and what have you, has spread throughout the known world as major news, because effectively it had an unfortunate occurrence that took place in a relatively small city, really, for all intents and purposes, in the middle of nowhere in the state of Wisconsin. And yet you had European broadcasters talking about it, people talking about it in Asia and the world over. And the matter of the Rittenhouse, as far as the details are concerned, I'm not going to really go into. Needless to say, I think that the Rittenhouse was exonerated in the proper fashion, and I don't have much else to say about that. But really what I want to talk about is the trial of the Rittenhouse in terms of the religious undertones that it, as well as many other things, have taken on over the last few years in particular. Because, again, you have this relatively minor event when compared to other things that have gone on in the past, and regarding the location it took place, regarding many, many aspects of the event, and yet it blew up, and everyone was involved, to the point where there was mass confusion. Many people thought, for example, that the so-called victims of the Rittenhouse were in fact black individuals, although that was absolutely not the case. And so one needs to ask the question, why is it that this minor event in the grand scheme of things, and even in the grand scheme of social and legal matters and crime, if you wish to even call it that, why did that blow up nationally and subsequently internationally as if it were a truly important event in the lives of every individual on planet Earth? And to answer that, I think we need to go back to this idea, this concept of the religious man, the so-called homo religiosus, the nature of man being such that he is by nature religious. Because effectively what has happened in these minor events that are then blown out of proportion to become major events, at least in my eyes, is the erection of a cosmology on planet Earth that did not exist prior, as well as the emergence of a new religious way of viewing the world, which is to say, of course, humans have always, to varying degrees, viewed the world religiously, but viewing earthly terrestrial events through a religious lens. And I think the trial of the Rittenhouse was one such event. And this extreme religiosity, specifically this earthly religiosity, is manifested in the extreme polarization that's taken place politically and socially. Because depending on which side you stood on during the trial of the Rittenhouse, you would alternatively look at this rather goofy teenager with an interest in guns as either a great saint or a sinner, perhaps possessed of a demon, who knows? And really that gets to the heart of the matter to my mind. The United States, in particular, being the epicenter of the so-called cultural movements, tends to push the entire world in various directions. And the same thing happened with the Rittenhouse. Because you really have to ask yourself, what would make people either demonize or lionize a goofy teenager with a bunch of guns? And the answer isn't so simple. But I wouldn't be the first person to say, obviously, that with the demise of Christianity on any large scale, which is to say the world over is becoming increasingly secular, including the United States, despite having higher rates of religiosity compared to Europe, that human beings almost inevitably will seek something out in lieu of that that will give them a sense of transcendence. And what's happened, to my mind, again, is humans have removed the realms of heaven and hell, paradise, otherworldly dimensions, and they have inserted them in the sphere of life that we live in. These used to be undetectable, invisible, unknown. But to quote the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre when he once said, "What is hell? It's the others." And so what has happened here is that the other, people who don't agree with us, people who are different, have become very much embodiments of sin. And what typically happens with human beings, as we are loath to think out of the box or with any nuance, is you end up in the situation of Manichaean moral dynamics. And so if you had looked at some of the tweets, mainstream media, social media commentary on the Rittenhouse, you would have thought he was one of the most vicious individuals on planet Earth, certainly in contemporary times and perhaps compared to some of the worst figures of history. And so what you really get is this new framework of almost metaphysics that take on moral proportions in the earthly realm that we inhabit. It goes without saying that in the case of Mr. Floyd, the previous year, similar things happened. The event, if you really think about it, in a different time would not have made the national news, let alone international news. It would have been covered in Minnesota and Minneapolis for sure. But due to the preponderance of social media and the internet, it became a global interest. In fact, you can walk through various cities of Europe and you will see murals of Mr. Floyd, sometimes referred to as Saint Floyd, strewn about with utterly no social historical connection to anything that might be related to the event in the United States. And that, again, is an instance of people's religious itch getting a hold of them and making them interpret, perceive things in a fundamentally different way than reality would otherwise inform them. Now, all this wouldn't be too terrible a thing if the religionists of the current year, who have moved both heaven and hell to our earthly realm, didn't also wield an inordinate influence in terms of politics and the social consequences that some of their proclamations can lead to. If people simply were lionizing or demonizing individuals, if they were sanctifying individuals like the deceased Mr. Floyd, then I'd say that it would be okay. It wouldn't be amazing, but it'd be acceptable. But in not too stark contrast to the early origins of the church and its subsequent terrestrial footing in the form of the papacy and the enormous power that the papacy wielded throughout the centuries, it seems as if there's no way to separate one's metaphysical beliefs from the realm that we inhabit. And so you end up in the situation where not only is everything a matter of life or death, but it's a matter of salvation or damnation. There were people externally, for the record, trying to influence the trial of the Rittenhouse. And in both ways, although arguably much more coming from the left. The demonization effect, the Manichaean dynamic. He is the spawn of Satan. He committed some heinous crime, etc., etc. And we see this in politics, in universities. Hell, we even see it in schools, in public schools. They're beginning to teach children what could only be referred to under a conventional moral and ethical perspective, heinous material, material of the carnal that one normally would argue has no place in a classroom filled with children, and yet they're doing this very thing. And so that is my big beef with the saints and the sinners of our time. Much more so with the left, obviously, although sometimes the right tends to engage in hyperbole as well. But that is the situation we find ourselves in. We have these humans who are just aching for some sort of religious experience and inject this ache and this desire, this yearning, into the politics of our world, and they meld. And it would be okay, I guess, in the sense of live and let live, were they to proceed, without their clamoring for power and influence. But, of course, that's never the way religion really works. It is almost never just a matter of the metaphysical and of the divine. It tends to transcend that, or rather descend from that, into the mundane and the earthly. Everyone, as always, thank you for tuning in. Please hit the like button, subscribe. If you're not yet a subscriber, hit the bell icon to follow my videos. And if I'm still alive, I will check you out later. May the gods watch over you. You take care. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.